Today we're talking about 29th Street. It's a 1991 film written and directed by George Gallo. Um, yeah, I really liked it. I don't know. I can see why Dom likes it. There is sort of it is heartwarming and it's like an earnest sort of quality about it. Um, like in terms of like the writing, I mean, was it like this tremendous piece? Probably not, but I could see like there's enough heart and particularly between like the relationship between father and son. I thought that really landed quite well. So I think there's just enough there for me to really connect with those characters. So opening shot, helicopter shot of Statue of Liberty. We see the Twin Towers. We hear kind of this um, jazzy music, inspiring music. Um, really kind of sets the tone. Yeah, we meet Frank Jr. Um, there's a voiceover during that opening, right? And he says that he doesn't want to win the lottery, which is already kind of intriguing. Like I'm wondering, like, oh, why? Wonder why that is. There's this lottery event that he attends, which is interesting. I've never really, I mean, I lived in New York for pretty much my first 25 years of life. But I've never, have you guys seen that? Like, is there an actual, is that a thing? Was that a thing? Like,
Well, this was the first ever.
okay. Oh,
So
it's the first ever. Okay.
it was the first. The Empire State Lottery was the first time that it came to New York. So I could
Mm,
believe that it was a big
yeah,
event. Like
I
it
think I
was,
could too. The finalist thing was a little interesting because I can imagine there being a lot of problems with like announcing the finalists, which was fun. I mean, it created a lot of interesting sort of moments in the film. So I just kind of went along with everything, I think.
I
Um,
think that is real though,
it
because
was a real
and we'll
event.
get in.
Wow.
Well, we'll get into we'll get into a lot,
Yeah.
but in terms of
Okay.
the reality of
Okay.
so it's based on a true story, and the
It
guy Frank
is.
Pesh
Okay.
was a finalist. He didn't actually win. Like
Hmm.
that's part of the story structure of like this specific movie, but he was actually a finalist in that first state lottery. That's all true. So that means that the whole finalist thing was real. I don't
Hmm.
know whether it was a dramatization for him to be published in the newspaper like that.
Yeah. That's a terrible idea
But
to publish like
I
names
mean,
in the
yeah,
newspaper
but
of
it's a
finally.
different time. I don't know.
Yeah.
We could probably look that up if that it was true or not. But there was definitely like a finalist stage because I read in multiple places that he was actually a finalist
Hmm.
for the lottery.
Interesting. Interesting.
He also is the guy playing the older brother, like the
Yeah,
real
yeah, yeah.
No
person.
Oh
way.
yeah, he
Oh,
is. Yeah,
Yeah,
I saw on the
yeah,
the wiki. His name is
huh.
actually, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
Okay.
Very,
yeah, so
very
Anthony
interesting.
LaPaglia plays him, and he plays his own older
It's
brother
fun.
in the
It's
movie because he's
fun.
also an actor.
Yeah, yeah. But so yeah, we he seems very down on himself in the beginning and in that during that event. So I'm kind of wondering why and why is he um something must be going wrong. Then he goes to that church and there was a snowballs at the at the church and gets arrested and we kind of flash back into his story. So yeah, I think pretty interesting opening, intriguing, compelling. I want to know more about Frank Jr. Yeah, pretty effective. I guess we'll start with Susie first today because it was Dom's choice. So any any initial impressions, Susie? What do you think?
It was very sweet,
Yeah.
incredibly charming. I know immediately I'm tracking, well, the Frank Pesh, I guess his character, throughout like his life until we see him. It's like told in flashback. So in that like I it feels like it was a device that was used quite a bit and to great effect. It worked really well. It reminded me for whatever reason of like um oh my God, why am I blanking on the name? I want to say Meredith Pierce, Mildred Pierce, sorry. But like in that way where it's like told in flashback, but basically you're tracking the mother and daughter story. The performances were so good. Like Danny Aiello is always so good, and then Anthony LaPaglia, I sort of always knew him and like him and everything, but he was he really tread that line between like affable idiot, and like he's very sincere. He loves his family. And you kind of are I guess to expect that from like the beginning where it's like we're gonna be treated to a New York story. It's gonna be sandwiched around Christmas. And that has like particular expectations that it already sets in motion for me. Um, Lainie Kazan, why is she always amazing in everything? And so I know I'm not going to be expecting violent deaths or anything. So it's like that like first few minutes, first 10 minutes, whatever tone is set up there it's still in effect. Yeah. Whatever people actually want to just like throw in. I obviously like the Goodfellas comparison is difficult not to make, but it's a different movie, totally different. I feel like even that little kid looks so familiar. Was he the little kid, in fact, from Goodfellas? Like Frank as a kid? I don't know, but yeah, it was really good, and I bawled at the end. I just want to
Mm.
feel something, and it made me feel all kinds of things.
Mm. Yeah, cool. Don, what about you? Like, when did you last watch this? And
Yeah, no, that's really, it's just good to hear because I think so. Just as a way of background, like for anyone who's watching this, like it was my turn to pick a movie, and I kind of like um I was genuinely curious how you would both react to it because I had this moment where I was like, there's a whole subtype of movies, especially 90s movies that I saw when I was young and that I love based on like, well, you don't know. Some I love based on nostalgia and some I love because they're good films. And some of those, I've watched and they just don't hold up. And people who
mm,
didn't watch them when they were younger, they just like, yeah, this is trash. But I had a feeling that this one would hold up. Um, or I was hopeful at least. I'm glad that you both felt uh yeah, I mean I love Goodfellas, obviously. We've talked about that. This was a year after Goodfellas, but it's sort of like I love being like sort of mafia adjacent here. Like the mafia is part of the plot, but it's lighter than that, right? Like the stakes are familial stakes for the most part, right? We're not really worried that, Danielle's character is going to get murdered by the mafia for a mob debt. Like that you could go to there as a possibility, but that's not what this movie is about. It's sort of a funny concept, right? It's like the idea of even the idea of being lucky can be a bad thing, right? It's like this, the curse of being lucky. That sort of an interesting. And so, like you said, when you open up with someone pretty much like praying to God to not win the lottery, that is like, okay, my ears are perked up. I'm listening. What could be a situation that could make someone beg not to win the lottery, and then they give it to you? And there's a lot of sort of contortions that we go through to make it a full length movie, right? Like, he gets, after he's throwing snowballs at the nativity scene, he gets to the police station and he's kind of like, well, I only know how to tell this story from the beginning. And it's just like, I'm glad that you do because I like the way you tell stories and all of these vignettes that you're telling are interesting to me, but like really you don't need like you don't need to tell me a half of these details to get to the end, which is like spoiler, I sold my lottery ticket in exchange for my father's debt, and therefore, if it wins, I actually, you know, lost $6.2 million in exchange for $10,000, which is, it's all very logical, but it takes a while to get there. But like the getting there is really just about a series of vignettes almost that are showing ways in which his luck has been a curse, well, some of them are just showing that he's lucky, which is important because it's important that other people in this world believe that he has this special luck, because that's why someone's willing to buy a lottery ticket. Because they really, throughout it, once he's a finalist, it's almost taken as a given that he's going to win the lottery. Um, but then also like how it could be a curse, and really just the family. Like this is really just an excuse to show scenes between a father and his son, a father and his wife. Um, that are just like really sweet. And yeah, I totally agree with you. Like I think ever since I saw this movie when I was probably, I don't know, less than 10 years old, I want to say. Um,
Wow.
I like always thought like Danny Aiello was like one of the best actors. Like I just every scene that he's in, like I just, and maybe just growing up on the East Coast with a bunch of Italian people, like I just felt like this is the guy that I know, and he almost to the extent where it's just like there are certain things I almost believe he couldn't do if he wasn't actually a part of this community in some way, which is very different than Anthony LaPaglia, right? Like Anthony LaPaglia is actually Australian, and so everything he's doing is very, and I think he's great too, but it's very
Mm.
much like um, he's an actor and he's coming to this and he's and he's playing the part really well. Whereas Danny Aiello is like so good that you just feel like he's actually this person. Um, and that it was similar to the feeling I had when I saw Mean Streets for the first time, which I saw it after this movie because I didn't see Mean Streets when I was that young. But you have this feeling where it's just people talking to each other like normal people talk, and it's not heightened in a way. You feel like it's someone putting a camera on real people, and there are a lot of like I'd say there's three or four like seriously dramatic scenes in this movie,
Mm.
which are just like fights between characters that are so well done. But as a child, especially, like because it was three or four scenes out of a lot of other like comedy or surrounding them, I was able to like take it in and enjoy it. You know what I mean? Like it's a totally different tone. It's not like I set up to see like an Italian American drama about a family struggling to get out of the city and make something themselves. It's like it's a comedy with this interesting premise about a lucky curse and a lottery ticket that also has some like real life drama built into it, because you almost feel like getting those actors in a room together, like they couldn't help but make those scenes like truly dramatic, right? Like, the and it takes its time, right? Like there's a scene after Danny Aiello's character has had the heart attack, and he's just like has this interaction where he's just staring at Lainie Kazan and she's singing opera, and it's just like
It's a beautiful
that
scene.
isn't really there to proceed to progress the plot, but it's like I'm so glad they took their time with that to see that interaction between the two of them, because if you just have people fighting all the time, then it can get very much like, why do I care about these people? Like they just
It
hate each other.
doesn't
They
work.
should just, like this is, and then at the end, that whole like that heartbreaking scene where the whole family is ready to go to
Mm.
the drawing together, and they've clearly been looking forward to this for so long. And he's, Anthony Frank Pesce Jr. is changing it up and saying, I'm going alone. And Danny Aiello goes up there and has this whole like I'm not a loser thing. And he's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince his son that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Um, and it's a really complicated moment, right? Because if we're still with Junior, we're kind of like, oh, you're making excuses. This is bullshit. I don't want to hear it. But if you're with Senior, you're kind of like, this is the reality, and you don't understand. Like you think you know something and you don't. Um, there's just a lot of like really complicated, great stuff going on, and something that is ostensibly, for the most part, a comedy, right? Um, I don't know. It's still stayed with me. I've seen it a few, well, probably close to 20 times, I would say,
Oh wow.
over my entire life, because I just keep coming back to it. And partially because not no one, but so many people have not seen or heard of this movie.
Mm.
So that's why it's like I wanted to like champion it a little bit too. Even when I said like let's watch it, it's only available because someone posted it on YouTube. It's not available on any of the streaming services. Like I literally can't pay to see this movie if I want to, except for buying physical media, which I do own a DVD of this movie from a long time ago, but that's like a really sad separate conversation, right? Like the fact that stuff can and will be lost because it's not currently licensed on a streamer. Um, and this is not it's not an insignificant movie, right? Like it's not a it's not a giant movie with huge stakes that's going to be a classic in some ways, but it is kind of like an early 90s classic if you are aware of it and you know of it. And I don't know. That's a sad thing that like movies can just disappear.
Mm,
And so I was kind of like, at least let's just mention it and maybe someone will watch it based on this, and at least two of you did. Um, you know,
yeah. I mean, the scenes that you mentioned really, for me, really make the movie. That opera, when the wife is singing, and it's I think just as important is Frank Jr. looking at them, right? Kind of looking. I think that was pretty powerful. That ending scene, certainly that blow up scene where he calls him a loser. I mean, that's a really, really important scene. It's one of those scenes that really kind of like those two scenes in particular, even like really change sort of the complexion of the movie for me. Like it reminds me of like I was thinking about the about Philadelphia. Do you guys remember that movie? You guys remember watching it? Um
Tom Hanks. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that's right.
Yeah, it was a while ago for me too, but like that movie wasn't quite
It's a
working
great
for
movie.
me. It is great. Like it was so like there was like such a black and white sort of like stiffness about it. But like that opera scene, the where Tom Hanks, if you remember, he's talking about his favorite opera. He's kind of drenched in the red, and he's talking about like how the protagonist is essentially everything is kind of burning around her, but she still believes in love and God, and Denzel Washington listens to this, and he goes home and hugs his child, and like everything at that moment, it just kind of really works and lands, and so it is one of those pivotal scenes that like until then I really wasn't connecting with anything. But it's interesting, like a scene like that can really like make or break something, you know? Um I don't know. Yeah, I was just thinking about that, like how important that moment was for me at least, like it because it wasn't really connecting. But like again, there are enough of those scenes in this movie. I think I agree with sort of the little vignette parts of the movie, that were completely necessary, but it's those kind of those bigger scenes that really work for me and really connected me to those characters. And yeah.
Yeah, I think well, those scenes that we mentioned are definitely like the most effective and they're the most dramatic. But I've always loved like the sort of there's a lot that happens in the familial dynamic that is not those big moments, but it
Mm,
still rings really true to me. Like so the daughter marries this guy and then he's sitting there in his white t-shirt and he says, "Oh, well, essentially your daughter hasn't done the laundry. Why don't you ask her?" And the father's like so upset by that. And he's just like, "What is she, your servant? Like, why is she doing your laundry?" Meanwhile, there's the moment where the mother is kind of like, "Well, I'm your servant. Like, I do all your laundry too, right?" So even those like little moments where it's comedy, but it's comedy that's showing like the hypocrisy in this, right? Like that humans can think two opposing things at the same time, right? Like, well, it's okay for me and your mother, but it's not okay for my daughter to be treated that way, right? And so it's not a heavy-handed dramatic thing, but it's like we're going to use comedy to like point out these things that are true.
mm,
And he's looking for his gun, like literally, like the mom who does everything. Like your mom has to tell you where you put your gun. Like you're a detective about to go, you're late for work, and like I could see that happening with like my brothers and my mom. Like it's just there's moments that are just like from a writing perspective, it did feel a little bit to me like a guy who was just like, okay, I have all these stories, and they're almost like they could be almost in any order, and they're just like what they're going to do is give you a great sense of who we are as characters and what our dynamic is like. And there's even going to be certain lines that you can tell are kind of like part of like a story that you'd be hearing from someone verbally that maybe don't even land the way that they would in the movie. But like if you pushed on it too hard, you might have eliminated a lot of this stuff and made it more efficient. but I think that would have made it worse. Like I'm always interested in that tension too, right? Like efficiency versus like especially with art, but really with most things, if you go towards the most efficient version of something, it loses something. Like you have to take time to get quality. And like there's a lot of time that we spend with these characters where it makes it rich. And then there's some things that are more like vignette like that don't pay off, right? Like there is a kind of like the Goodfellas moment where in the beginning where he's giving you the names of all of the cast of characters of the ne'er-do-wells that he hangs out with, which like we have to meet them and they are seen in different scenes throughout the movie, but it did feel a little bit like, well, that's not going to pay off in a way, or like I don't really care if like this is the friend that spits all the time except for like a quick gag. Um, so like if I didn't love this movie, I would be able to go through and pick apart from a writing standpoint, like, this feels a little bit forced or this feels a little bit unnecessary. But it's like interesting to me that sometimes like the gestalt of it all, right? Like the
Yes.
fact that like, yeah, you didn't need that one specific line, but these five lines together you do need. Um it- it's hard to talk through too, because it's just a feeling, like the idea of 90s movies that I can't imagine them making anymore. Like this would be for me one of the first examples I would bring up as like, well, why don't we make this type of movie anymore? Because it's still really good and it wouldn't be that expensive and people would like it. But like maybe it's just that the stakes aren't quite as high. It's not, I don't know, like but again, all that and the fact that the tone, right? Like it seems like we've moved so much more towards a movie being a drama or a comedy, or like something that's labeled as a dramedy, which is really usually a drama with like a couple moments of lightness. Like this is really it's closer to true life in that it does include both at heightened points throughout. And it makes it just easier to watch. Like it's not a tough sell to be like, yeah, let's throw this movie on and watch it and enjoy it. And I don't have to feel like ravaged at the end. And yeah, it is a very Hollywood ending, but like I'm okay with that because I don't think there's a better version of this movie with a sad ending. So maybe that's it. Maybe the 90s was more okay with happy endings and that became like the Hollywood thing and people like overreacted to that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot to unpack there, I think. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, the ending is it was interesting to me. And I guess it kind of speaks to your, larger sort of question about why, why these movies aren't made. I mean, what did you think of the ending, Susie? Did you I think for me, like it did feel pretty, I mean, pretty contrived in terms of like, him giving, the money to the guy and then the father knowing and then, like and then him getting the money from the other guy. It just seemed a little I just thought it would be kind of cleaner to have like a Rocky like ending, Like so if he just lost, it doesn't have to be a sad ending if he loses. Like, he can lose, but like I think they can come to some sort of understanding where like, okay, like I sacrificed this money and he clearly understands that his father sacrificed for him, it kind of brings their relationship full circle and it could be a nice moment. There doesn't need to necessarily be yes, it's sad. And if you don't have the money, the $6.3 million, of course, like, and that changes I just didn't want the money to kind of interfere with that moment. You know what I mean? Like because the money does change things. Like it makes if you're desperate for money, like it's a very sad thing. Um, a lot of the times. So I just didn't want that to sort of affect that moment. And I sort of feel like it did when they won and everyone's celebrating. It just, I don't know. Any thoughts about the ending, Susie? What do you think?
I get what you're saying about
Yeah.
it feeling a bit contrived. Um, but to be honest, a lot of contrived endings don't bug me. I think
Mm,
it's because like I already kind of know, um, once he leaves that house, in spite of everything, like that's that moment where it's all gonna be the opposite of what everyone says, where it's like Danny Aiello was like, don't ever come back. You know he's coming back. And all this stuff, he sacrifices that ticket. And so you kind of I'm already preparing the landing runway there for
Interesting.
what's gonna come, and I
Yeah.
know nobody's gonna die, certainly not a violent death. Probably it's gonna be on the happier end of things, you know what I mean? This is where I'm at. The the efficient storytelling, Dom, that you had mentioned is interesting. The there is kind of like only um this way to tell this type of story, which is like, this is my life up until right now. And I'm going to tell it to you because you won't really know why this moment matters unless you know all of it. And the things the movie chooses to show us are slices of life that without which you will have less of a movie. I'm not suggesting that you're suggesting to take them out or anything like that. It's just that like I think people don't know like with their brains what to do when they're not like following some kind of psychological thriller or a detective movie. This is kind of just Wonder Years. You're getting like an episode per sort of like little vignette or scene in my life. And as long as it's entertaining enough for you to keep watching, I've done my job. And so it's sort of like that intro, the big second act, and then sort of like the ending. Because we know like the movie's telling us that this is a movie about father and son. That's the love story we're tracking. And then so all that stuff in the middle is gonna be to me the ways in which he's kind of maybe fucking about a little bit, not doing totally the right things, but it's also not like Goodfellas, and he's just like going into some mafia deep end at all. Um, these are imperfect people. They're not totally likable and they're not totally unlikable. And so in that way, it rings true to me. And I actually really appreciate this type of storytelling. It makes me feel like you're more in control than if it was like, and then this has to happen, and then that, and then this. I actually feel like I don't have to pay attention to a lot of that type of storytelling. Whereas in this, I'm like, I'm just wrapped in it, you know, because like it's when you hear somebody tell a story they've told a billion times before, and they tell it because they're good at it. And you kind of get into the rhythm of this thing, and that's how I felt. So there is no like efficient way to tell the story. There is no other way to tell the story.
Yeah.
And I feel like producers or God knows who, but they just don't like it anymore. And it's like, I'm telling you, I like it. And at least two other people on this whole earth, at least were able to sit through it and enjoy it. So we're either the only three on the planet or there's more out there.
Yeah, I think that the Wonder Years analogy and that like I think yeah, I mean, and that had voiceover too. Like, I think the difference maybe is like now that you're hearing you talk about it, like, is that it does feel like a story someone has told a bunch of times, right? And what comes from that is that it's a story told well. And
Mhm.
so, like, every one of these, what we could call as like vignettes of like, through his life, like, they're interesting in and of themselves. Whereas, like, people fear the version of a story that doesn't progress because, like, they might cut to one of these vignettes and it's boring and irrelevant. And then you're like, okay, that needs to be cut. But, like, it's almost like it feels like there's a guy who has lived for, 30 something years and has chosen the 5 stories from his life that are actually genuinely really interesting, and he's told them so many times, he's gotten really good at telling them to you, and he's gonna tell them to you, and we're gonna weave in, like, the theme that connects them all is how I was born with a lucky star, kind of, um, and, like, it at some point, we did progress or change over into more of a plot driven thing where it's just like scene A happens, so then scene B happens directly because it has to after scene A. And like I've fallen into that trap sometimes with my own writing, and it becomes like a little bit of a slog where you're kind of like writing these scenes because the scenes have to occur rather than just like sitting in a scene and being like, what's the conflict here and what's enjoyable about it? And why do I want to like live in this moment, you know?
Hmm.
but yeah, I really felt like I don't think there's a part of this movie that I would say like, oh well, that's a slow part where he's talking about this, or yeah, that part is really not really, you know, something I wanted to see. It's like every single one of them. The other thing too is like even though it's one main character, he's always with either his father or his father, his brother, or so you get so much out of how they interact with each other, right? Like they're just going to buy a car or they're going to pick up the check for the car from the insurance. Like that's not about the plot of like, well, this was the part of my life where we picked up a check or tried to pick up a check from the insurance company. It's about how does the father interact with the brother and this, with the two sons. And also then from a theme perspective, the fact that like once his father goes in, it turns into like if he's so lucky, it's almost like Danny Aiello is the opposite of that, right? Like everything Danny Aiello touches turns to trash. Um, and I don't know. I just think, and there is some stuff that's like very, contrived, but you could also say just call that structure. And for me, that was satisfying because I like it, right? Like you start the movie with the younger version of him looking up on the marquee, and he says he wants to get his name up there, and it literally ends with his name up there as like the lottery winner. Um, and like there's a lot of moments in the dialogue that kind of repeat back as callbacks for that. So it's one of those things where I think it would be super easy for someone to be sort of too cool for school and be like, oh, that was that Hollywood ending that like, yeah, great, everything works out perfectly in the end and they win the lottery and there's no like yes, that is true. And you can take that, but like also you're just not gonna like this movie if you're feeling that way. Whereas for me, I was like, if I had a good ride along the way and there is an earned happy ending, like I'm okay with that. Right. And like, what would I get out of this movie if the ending is any of the other obvious possibilities? Okay, the mob guy actually does get all his money. I don't really get anything great out of that. Or he doesn't actually win the lottery and the debt is wiped out in exchange for the ticket that was a loser. And then that's more luck. Like it's, I don't when I imagine either of those endings, I don't like it more than the ending where this family finally gets out of struggle and they get this like $6 million and they move upstate and get the house that they want. Um, yeah, I don't know.
I
Yeah.
think it has to do with how the luck aspect is treated. It just is treated like it's the truth and Lucky Frank, you know? Um, so it's not it was sort of like he was always going to win that money. I was like I watched like just snippets of the beginning of this, and there was that scene where somebody tells him like early on, I don't think it's Tucci, but he's like, you were born under a lucky sign, but you got to know what to do with it.
Yeah,
It's
the
like maybe
bar,
lucky
the
sign,
guy
that's
who owns the
you know.
club, the narcoleptic
Oh, is that
guy.
the guy who? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's like, you just don't know what to do with it or whatever, and it's like, it could be that that's the hint of the movie where it's like it's the end because he maybe now knows, or it's like he's done something worthy in order to like almost be worthy of that luck that he's, as opposed to like you just happen to be lucky. You can actually make your own luck
Right, and
because
he
it's
does
spreading
he
around you.
does perform that action where he turns in the
Yeah,
ticket, right? Like
yeah,
he does, it's not a passive thing. Like he has that test. And like yeah, that's kind of the theme, right? Like if you've seen a Bronx Tale, the whole theme was like there's nothing worse in the world than wasted talent. Like this is kind of almost like the lighter, like there's nothing worse than wasted luck,
you
right?
know.
Like I've always felt like the best possible thing a human can hope for is not being lucky. It's being lucky and knowing it when you're lucky, right? Like knowing, like
Mhm.
living in it, being lucky and being able to enjoy the fact that you're lucky and actually appreciate it. Like that's pretty much the best possible thing we can aspire to. So like like all of those things, like yeah, you could say it's kind of like a broad comedy and something, but like it does make you think about those things at least in a way that like again that tone that mix of comedy and drama, that true mix and like real slice of life stuff, like I have just always really enjoyed it.
That's how life is. I think like it is often jumbled up and even touching each other. Like you can have a horrible fight, and then suddenly you're laughing about something with the person you're fighting. It seems deranged, but all of us have been through it, and it happens all the
Especially
time.
with family, right? Like there's like that safety net where you're kind of just like, well, we know that it's going to be okay, so we can take it to 11 and the downside because we know that there's that safety net, and you feel like that's there too, right? Like when he says like at the end, he's like, "Don't come back." It's kind of like a family don't come back, right? Like it's like he
Yeah.
means it. It's not that he doesn't mean it, but you also don't expect that he's never going to see his son again. It's they have that relationship where that would not actually be a possibility, you know?
I think it's sort of like you're feeling it in your chest because Danny Aiello's character obviously loves his children and really loves Frank. And that's why we needed to see all of that relationship between the father and son.
Well,
I found it very
and then Junior proves it, right? By actually going off and giving this ticket in. Like I think that's so key. It's actually, one
yeah,
day
that's the moment as opposed
yeah.
to where did the money end up, you know?
Right. And that's the thing. It's like so much of this movie is based on like he's definitely going to win, and that moment means so much more because we believe that, right? If he's trading in a 1 in 50 chance for $10,000, that's kind of like, oh, that's kind of a smart thing to do actually. Take
Yeah.
$10,000 in your hand versus, but if he knows, quote unquote knows he's going to win, or is very worried at least he's going to win, to trade that in um it means a lot more. And like it one day we'll talk through Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And
Did you watch it?
um no, I haven't watched the new one, but like we've mentioned that the 70s one
Oh,
is
that
my
one's wonky.
favorite film of all time. And it's one of the movies that I always bring up as like people always say, oh, the book's always better, and I'm like, no, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is the movie is way better than Charlie and the Chocolate Factory the book. And one of the many reasons is the fact that um, there's that moment in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory where Charlie gives up the everlasting gobstopper because it's the right thing to do, and that's sort of like the test that he passes in order to be worthy of the Chocolate Factory, which does not exist in the book at all. Like in the book, Charlie is just by default the winner because all of the other kids die.
Dead,
And
yeah.
it's just like he's just this passive, like, well, I guess I'm still alive, so we're gonna go with you're the winner now. Um, and so this is a pretty direct mirror, right? Like he takes the action.
Yeah.
He could very easily say, you know what, I'm going to win this thing. I'll pay back that $10,000.
And I'll buy my
Uh,
family house.
he could have tried to argue with the people when they come into that club and say, look, I'm a finalist in the lottery tonight. At least wait one more day, and then there's no tension and there's no ending. Instead, he's like, all right, I'm going to do what I have to do to save my father here. I'm gonna give you the ticket. And it's again, it's all very neat, and it is kind of, you could say, contrived, maybe formulaic, but like I don't care because it all makes sense and it's all enjoyable to me. And like again, the plot of it, like the plot of like, well, he goes to give the ticket and he give it to a guy who was standing in, and because his father knew this is what he was gonna do. Like it's almost at that point, it's almost like, well, you thought of a way. I don't want it to be true that he gave away the ticket. You thought of a way for that to be true. I'm going to buy it because I want to buy it. If I don't want to buy it, if I want to poke holes in that, I can surely do that too. But it's like that's not why I'm here for this movie right now.
Yeah.
So it's just for me, it's just like a really feel good personal movie, but with serious dramatic scenes mixed in. And that's, for me, that is like the takeaway here is like it doesn't bring the whole movie down. It doesn't feel like, what am I watching here all of a sudden? I think if you only watch the trailer for this movie, you would be like, what the hell? You would like, those scenes would feel out of place. Like it's got this 90s guy, male voiceover, like, and then one
Meet
day, like
Frank.
it's, yeah, exactly. Like
He's
it's
our
very
guy.
much like, what? That's this movie. But but the movie itself doesn't, it teaches you like this is going to be reality, and it's going to have a whole lot of like ups and downs, and it's going to feel real. And I think I count it as a success, and I don't think it's easy to do, to have that, like, to play with tone in that way. And I wish there were more movies that still tried to do that, because I personally, like, I almost never go into a movie that is listed as a straight drama and I'm like looking forward to it. I'm like much more, let me watch a drama that has a whole lot of comedic relief built into it, and I'm going to enjoy, like most recently, I think on the plane, I watched American Fiction, and I felt like that was maybe a good example, like modern example of like something that is a very dramatic movie and has very like interesting themes, but has a really good solid amount of comedy mixed in throughout it that made me feel like it wasn't a chore to watch the movie. I really enjoyed it straight through and was able to take the really serious parts as well. And I don't know, somewhere, maybe we're going back to it now, but somewhere I feel like in the 2000s, maybe it was just things got real heavy, or things got to be like only like totally silly comedy that has no basis in reality, like the type of comedy that establishes their own heightened reality from the beginning and just goes to it, which is fine too. But this is not that. This is like a very reality based comedy with um, a serious dramatic scenes as well.
Mm. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why that shift happened, and it is interesting though. The movies are. Do you guys think like something like it's not a great analogy, but like Christmas Story, Ralphie, it sort of kind of reminds me of like it is kind of like a slice of life sort of movie. That I guess that it's different because it is considered like a classic and it's on like every year, like like 100 times in a row,
I
So
mean, it's a fair comparison. Like I
yeah.
love that movie too. It also has voiceover narration, and it also does have these sort of like slice of life vignettes throughout it.
Do you think a movie
Um,
like that would ever be made today though? You know what I mean? Like, and would people I think well, that movie is a little different because there's so much goofiness in it, and like I think people like the campy goofiness of it. And I think that's why it's replayed like 1,000 times over Christmas. But like I don't know. Like
it's interesting that both of those movies take place in the past, right? Like obviously the voiceover makes a lot more sense because it's someone telling a story, but there's almost like something that it's like it's easier to accept some of these things because it's like I'm removed. I'm removed by time, and also I'm taking into this the understanding that some of the things I'm being told are going to be seen through the lens of like I'm telling you how this happened, as opposed to a
This is
more
what happened.
traditional movie where it's like I'm watching something unfold. Um, so maybe there's something to that too. Like maybe that is part of and the Wonder Years as well, right? Like it was released in the 80s, took place in the 60s. There's something about like inherent in the form
yeah.
is, well, you're listening to a version of the story that I'm telling you from, 15, 20 years ago. And so you have to like that, know that that is like part of what you're getting is that lens. And a Christmas Story, I don't know exactly what the years are, but it's definitely told as in a much older voice talking about his childhood. Um, yeah, but again, like also Goodfellas does that, and so does Bronx Tale. Like all, that's
Mhm.
um but yeah, I mean, I've always tended to love things that are, I like the cozy feeling of a voiceover, like voiceover narration. I feel like is the same feeling I get when there's an opening sequence that is really well directed, right? Like you feel like you're in good hands.
Mhm.
You feel like none of this is gonna be by accident. It's like a promise that like if you give me an hour and a half of your time, you're in good hands, and like I will entertain you in some way. Um, And it's funny because there's any number of movies that use voiceover narration that terribly, and those are the ones that we forget. But the ones that use it well, Shawshank Redemption, like the ones that use it well, almost for me tend to more quickly jump to like the top of my list of movies that I love because it's like, well, if you did it and you did it well, there's probably a good chance I'm going to like it even more because I just get a better sense of the interior of the character, or like I said, just that feeling that like I'm enjoying someone telling me a story that they've practiced. Like I tend to
Mm,
like read books that are in the past tense as well. Like if I read a book that's in the present tense, I generally takes me a little bit more to get into it because I'm kind of like,
Mhm.
I don't know, the storytelling aspect of a lot of these things is personally very intriguing to me.
mm,
I equate it a lot with it- people sharing anecdotes at like a party or bar or something where it's like you just have like a 2 to 10 minute story often that somebody's told before. You don't often interject with questions. It's usually told in one kind of monologue and stuff, and some of them are more entertaining than others. But I always got that feeling. It's like you're entering into a contract with your audience, and for the scope of the movie, I'm basically going to tell you the tale of what I'm setting up right now, and then hopefully surprise you at the end. You know, none of these are deal breakers, but yeah, I get that.
The other thing, Soul, I don't know if Susie, if you got to catch it, but the other thing it did slightly remind me of as I was watching it again, it made me think of our discussion of The Hill. Do you remember the
Oh yeah,
baseball
yeah,
movie?
yeah, yeah.
And how
But that
like
was
unsuccessful that was? And
yeah. There is a big difference between that movie and this movie, you know?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I,
I'm just trying to even
yeah.
remember the season.
This is my point,
Um,
right? Like there was voiceover that you don't remember. There was, but
was
the
there
reason I
voiceover in
thought
that
of it was
movie?
because I
Was there
think
voiceover in
so.
that?
I think maybe. I don't know. I'd have to double check. But either way, the reason what I want to say is like I think on that conversation I said it felt to me like a guy in a bar telling me the stories
Yeah.
of his life that were interesting, but the way he was telling them to me just like grated with me. And I was just like, you've told the story 100 times and it's annoying to me the way you're telling it to me, and I'm not digging it. And you haven't really structured them in a way that they're satisfying when you put them together. And just like everything about it just kind of like did not work for me with The Hill. And for this movie, it felt like, okay, this dude picked the right stories. He knows how to tell them well. They make sense together, and I'm here for the ride. And like, I want to meet this dude. Do you know what I mean? Um, like, I don't know. It's also the other thing I was wondering about too is like, do I like this movie more than other people would because it's an East Coast movie, because it's an Italian American movie, which I have like, you know, and so I was kind of like, well, is that part of the reason? Which it still could be part of the reason I like it extra. Who knows? But like, um, there are plenty of movies like that that are where that's true that I don't like as much. So I know that it's not only that. Um, and it's interesting because Frank Pesh we talked about we mentioned briefly, like, so he's in the movie, he plays his older brother. And the sort of story is by him and another person, but he didn't write the movie. The director wrote the actual screenplay for it. So again, I've never met these people. I would love to, but to me, that like what my brain has filled in is like these this real guy has kind of told him the story of his life with the highlights in a really entertaining way, and then the director has actually come and like put those bullet points of an outline into a structure that actually works as a cohesive screenplay. And so that's where the elements that are a little bit like cuter come in, with the book ending of the marquee and well, you really need to win the lottery for this story to work, that type of,
Mm.
but I think all those choices work really well together. And I appreciate both the fact that these are based on a true story and the fact that it was pushed into a structure that is satisfying. Um, so that's the story of that I've told myself of like how this actually happened, because some of it just feels so real to me.
Yeah,
Um,
the Frank Senior, like he is very. I'd love to get Susie's thoughts on this too, just because I think women have a different sort of perspective, but like he's like reminiscent of my father, you know. I mean, he is there are aspects of him that are have like sort of not so great at, like, he is racist in a way, he's sexist in a way, but it doesn't stem from like this evil, terrible place. It's from like him wanting to survive, right? He's a survivor. Um, yeah, and he reminds me of like Troy from Fences a little bit too. Um, yeah, he's trying to make it, he's trying to uh protect his family, and he's kind of doing what he knows how to do to survive, in a very rough place. Um, and I think that that's also what lands for me at the end, when he kind of tells, Junior that this is life. This is what I had to do, right? It's an interest. He's complex. He's a complex character, and I do appreciate that about Frank Senior. What do you think about Frank Senior, Susie? I'm just kind of wondering what.
Um, I love him. I think he was really well drawn out. Maybe like into my idealized form, I would also be able to put my parents in a similar situation. If both from the good and the bad, I see things that I'm like, uh-huh, yeah. Even things where it's like, oh, I'll never get that, but I get why it's important. You know what I mean?
Mm,
I loved all of that. I think that showing us Frank in more holes than fabric is great because it just is, we're still in Frank Jr.'s point of view. So the kid stuff is one thing, but like when he's in his adulthood and we're still sort of like only seeing piecemeal of this guy you've spent all of your life with, and yet you kind of like don't know him from Adam. It's like that's how we live with our families, actually. So like all of that, even though maybe the details of it aren't true, but like how alienated you can feel sometimes from them
yeah.
is something we all share. So I started like talking about Darla differently. I just realized in this recent Q&A where I basically, instead of saying, these are for all the awkward people out there like you and me and whatever, instead of that, it's like, it's speaking to the awkward person in everyone because we've all got it. It manifests as something else, but we kind of all sense when we know it's happening. So I really appreciated that drawing of Frank, which is different from like the confusion that Minus Man had, where it's sort of like Brian Cox's character was also more holes than fabric, but it was like some of it was just kind of puzzling. Like, if anything, the stuff you chose to show me, and I say you, the movie, the stuff you chose to show me is not necessarily like filling in the picture in the best way.
Yeah, it
I'm
doesn't really
still confused.
explore it in an interesting way. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, but as far as that, I appreciated it, and for whatever reason, I watched those like maybe that first 8-10 minutes bits like in a little, and there's that part where they're all Danny Aiello is getting giving his son and friends a ride to enlist,
Mm,
and that guy in the back is talking about I think we're born, we get older, and then we die. And it's like, oh yeah. So even in that is a guide to how to watch the movie. This is what this movie's going to be about. And I remember that line from watching it originally, but like then it like I was like, oh yeah, the movie's trying to clue me in. You're trying to help me out, movie. Thank you.
Yeah, and they called back to that too. Like they were like, "Oh, maybe
Yeah,
there is something to that." And
yeah.
and it's interesting too because like with Frank Sr. in that last scene where like he's blowing up, um, Frank Jr. is like, "What did you ever do with your life?"
Mhm.
And he says like, "I stayed, right? Like I did everything I could to support my family essentially for 35 years, whatever." And you could kind of read that, and I think I probably did when I was younger as like, yeah, that's your excuse or like, so what? And Frank Jr. says as much, right? Like you're supposed to stay. But now, being almost 40, just because someone's supposed to stay doesn't mean they do, right? So you should actually not take it for granted when someone does stay and when someone does everything, even if they're supposed to do it. The fact that they do it and, yeah, you could diminish that and say, well, he was born and he got older, he had kids and he died. But like that's all of our story, and the fact that that's true doesn't mean that the details aren't important, and the fact that the choices people make and what they do aren't important. And like the movie doesn't judge the characters, right? Like, yeah, he is a racist, right? Because he has that whole section where he says, "Don't go up to Spanish Harlem," but he's a racist because he's worried for his kid.
right.
And then the movie kind of proves him right, right? Like he goes out, he takes the girl out, and as soon as he says, like, oh yeah, her brother Jesus loves me, he shivs him, right? Like 30 seconds later. So the movie is kind of like, it's still wrong to say like don't go up to Spanish Harlem, Puerto Ricans hate Italians. That's obviously a generalization that's not, we don't like the character for saying that. But then the movie says like, well, he really just is worried for his kid, and his kid does get in trouble, um, because defying what he said. And then it winds up, the luck thing, and he winds up saving his life, which again, like I have the feeling that has to be true, right? Like that has to be one of the things, like that has to be one of the bullet points that like when Frank Pesh, the real Frank Pesh, is telling his story of how he's lucky, like some version of that has to be true.
He's
Because
like lifting up your shirt, check that
yeah,
out.
yeah. Like it's just like this magical, like, hey, a lot of like not even a lot, let's say 5 or 6 really interesting things have happened in my life. Let me tell you about them.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, like the movie just doesn't judge Danny Aiello. It's not really it's just about like, this is the reality of this family, and I'm just going to tell it to you. And I'm confident enough that I'm going to tell you that my family is interesting enough, my life is interesting enough, and I'm going to tell it in an interesting enough way that I'm not going to be wasting your time when I tell you. And it is, right? It's not somebody in a bar telling you shit that is totally irrelevant to anything, that's boring in a boring way. And so it's like the fact that it pays off on that promise to me is just like, I want to see if someone told me like, oh, here's 5 other movies like 29th Street with totally different characters, but that do exactly this thing of someone telling you parts of their life that will illuminate something, I'm going to be like, I'm in. I'm going to watch those 5 movies like over this month. And so if you haven't seen this movie and that sounds intriguing to you, I feel like there's probably a good chance that you would like this. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that discussion. If you found it interesting, informative, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It'll really help us out. We have some really cool discussions lined up for you, so I hope you're looking forward to them, and I'll see you next time.